Hey everybody, and welcome to another scenario playthrough video. This is part number 2 of Mel's World, which is the 13th scenario in the original game series. Last time around, we fixed up the inverted coaster in the park, and we started to fill out the whole space with some rides and things. But now we're going to build our first of our custom coaster attractions of any kind of reasonable size. We did do a small wooden coaster last go around, but this is going to be our first kind of big custom ride, and it's going to be an Arrow suspended coaster. So I feel like suspended coasters are very, very well suited to interesting terrain. Just makes them more dynamic and just more thrilling to begin with. I kind of go back to Big Bad Wolf and Eagle Fortress as sort of the two best of those types of rides, and both of those use the terrain fairly well. So we're going to do the same here and use kind of this whole back area of the park. And to do that, we're going to start in the middle with the kind of great signature left-right drop there into a curve there that's going to get those cars to swing outwards pretty well. In general, I like to, as I've said before, kind of highlight the key feature of the ride and build that first. So A, it's in the right spot, and B, I can really ensure that the thing that I'm most interested in with the ride is where we start. So that's back here, which actually the guests aren't really going to see, so it's going to be kind of a surprise because it's sort of hidden back there in the woods a little bit. But now I'm kind of working a little bit backwards. We built up through the drop, the lift hill, and the station, which we're kind of working on right now, just trying to get this to sit kind of nicely here. There's not a lot of flat space to work with back here, so we are kind of limited in that, and I don't love having supports that are super, super high up off the ground for stations and for pathways and things like that. So we're going to try and nestle this in kind of near to the wooden coaster, so it's about as close to the ground as we can get. We're going to extend this turn here at the bottom of the big drop just so that we kind of create that nice sweeping corner here, and it lets us space it out properly to get up and over the in-run to the lift hill and get to this other side where we can kind of finish off the bulk of our layout here with the sort of like figure 8 type element. Again, using the terrain here fairly well, I think. And now we just got to finish it up. So we've got our brake run already put down, so now it's just a matter of trying to kind of thread this thing through underneath of the lift hill and then up and around and into the brakes. So I like this sort of interaction here where you get kind of this above and below section. This one has the same struggle as the inverted coaster has, where you have a 3 height clearance issue. So these two below the track type coasters have that bit of trouble there. So the clearances are slightly more challenging, but it's just a matter of planning it in, and that ends up being just fine. But there's our lift, or our coaster, and I feel like this one turned out pretty alright from a layout standpoint. We're going to have a bit of a dead end here, which isn't the worst. If anybody's ever been to Kings Island, you know that their suspended coaster, now called Bat, there has a long approach and pathway all the way down to the coaster, and there's really nothing else down that way. So I think this is okay to come spur off of that main circle of path just a little bit. So here's our ride. It's not a very long coaster, but that's okay. I didn't really intend it to be, and suspended coasters aren't typically that long either. I did make some adjustments here just because I wanted to adjust that kind of climbing turn and diving turn there just to make it a little bit smoother. We added a section of straight track up at the top of it, and typically I use straight track to try and give it some a little bit of smoothness when I do coasters, and the suspended coaster is no different here, so I think it does help it look a little bit smoother. So we ended up starting with the Top Gun colors with the silver and the blue, and then we ended up with the more current Bat colors with the orange track, and I think that looks fairly nice for that little woods area back there. So we'll put some small bits of fencing in here. We do have a kind of nice interaction with the train there, so it kind of makes the train feel less like it goes off into the wilderness, so you can kind of still see it all the way around, which is all right, I think. But now we've got to kind of continue to fill out this area back here, and the next thing to do would be a flume, and we've got this little depression right here, this kind of valley that we can have as our retention pond pool. So this will allow us to drop in our flume right here and have a splashdown over top of the water. While it's not, you're not going to see me do it every single time, I do like to have a body of water somewhere near my flume, and typically I put it at the base of the first drop so that the water splashes into the pond and not into the landscape nearby. Just sort of a realism suggestion. And also with water attractions like this in theme parks, when the ride is done for the day, water will typically get drained out into some kind of a holding basin, and in this case that holding basin would be the lake right there. That allows them to do maintenance and all that kind of thing in the trough itself. So that's why I typically like to throw in these lakes right at mine, and typically it just sticks with at the base of the drop, just because it kind of makes the most sense for it to be there. You'll see it with rapids rides too, but generally those ponds either are kind of a big basin at the end of the ride that the boats are kind of guided through, or it's just entirely unrelated to the attraction itself. But here we are trying to get this to kind of flow through the woods here just a little bit to make a kind of wilderness experience, I guess, where it feels like it's sort of kind of off in the middle of nowhere. I always sort of like that on flumes that are sort of large and meandering. Dorney Parks always had kind of a nice, kind of went up the big hill there towards Hydra and then kind of meandered all around before a fairly sizable drop that was almost laid into the hillside, which I always appreciated. So for me, flumes that sort of use nature and go out and do things and then come back are always sort of a more interesting way to do them to me. So that's what we're going to do. Too many boats to start because I don't like when they back up all the way to the drop, so we'll do that. And then we're going to go and put back some of these trees because our building process has removed a lot of the trees. That is one sort of struggle with the whole iterative process of building, because a lot of times you end up building a bunch of different options for things and it ends up removing trees, and of course when you delete that section that you don't like, the trees don't come back. So a lot of times after these builds we come back and throw in the trees afterwards just to help it fill out a little bit. I'm also going to expand the pond right here, and also I added a little bit of rock structures there at the drop, so consider it maybe a little bit of theming, maybe some artificial rock work or something, just to give it a little bit of interest there. Now at the same time I'm going to change the plaza colors, because I hadn't really done this so far with giving the path different colors, but I do like to call out the different types of path with different textures. So in this case I hadn't really used this red and I guess sort of cream colored checkerboard path. There's a lot of these ones, and I fully realize these came in under Loopy Landscapes, I think, not under the original game, but nonetheless we have them available with the SV4 file, so we're going to stick with it. So we got this fairly large section up here by the original thrill rides that came with the park. So what we're going to do is actually demolish a section of this hill and flatten it out. And this is a suggestion that came in chat, was to do a Vekoma Invertigo, which is kind of fun because now it means we have 3 under-track rides here in this park, and of our 5 coasters now, we now have 3 of them, which are this. So kind of interesting. Again, we don't have the trains for it, but we also didn't have the 4 across trains for the inverted coaster, so we're just going to have to use your imagination a little bit. Also, I'm realizing that I said earlier that our Suspended was our first large custom coaster for the scenario, which is a lie. Clearly, because there's the vertical drop coaster right there, so disregard that one. So these coaster types aren't super difficult to make. It's just the Boomerang that also came standard with the corkscrew coaster. It's one of the saved layouts, but just with the inverted coaster option. Because we don't have custom supports or scenery like that, we end up kind of having this little bit of an awkward bit where both of the spikes just are kind of unsupported. So looks a little funky and maybe not my favorite, but nonetheless, it's works as a sort of interesting coaster type, and it was a good suggestion in the chat. So we are going to go with it. As it turns out, I tend to like Invertigo layouts better than any of the other Vekoma Boomerang types. Like for me, the Invertigo is better than a Boomerang and also better than a giant inverted Boomerang, I think. So I am a big fan of these coasters. Got to ride one more and then I have the whole set, which is kind of fun. But this works fairly well, and it's going to give us a fairly compact additional coaster to work with too. Lets us do some adjustments here to our pathway layout. Does make this area feel a little bit crowded, like the drop tower there ends up feeling kind of squeezed in there. And part of that is because the pathway encroaches on the base of that ride, just above it. But it does feel maybe a little bit tight compared to where we started, where everything had a little bit more space to breathe. But we'll do a little bit of pathway work here in just a minute, because one of the things that I don't love about that area still is how high up off the ground the vertical drop coaster station is. It's just, unfortunately, a little bit of the nature of how it fit in with the existing terrain. But we can make this work without doing complete wholesale changes, and a little plaza here helps. We're kind of in this valley a little bit. I did say earlier that I really liked the way that this path or this park was laid out, and I don't really want to get rid of that too much, so we are going to hopefully not do too much of that. Okay, so now it comes to adjust the bobsled coaster. So this is a Mack bobsled, and the original layout actually isn't that bad. The inverter coaster was a much worse layout to begin with, but the layout isn't terrible. It just doesn't follow a lot of the typical tenets that you would expect from a Mack bobsled coaster. One of which is it doesn't have the mid-course block brakes, which is fair because the block brakes didn't exist in original RCT. But since we have the pieces and since we're using those, we're going to throw that in there. This is a fairly long coaster, so it actually could do with having 2 mid-course blocks, and we're going to go through eventually and add in the second one. But for now, this kind of first section here, just before this kind of stacked helix, seemed like the best place to put it. So we'll have this sort of approach, and then we will have the rest of it coming from there. I'm going to pause and throw in a little food stall there since we unlocked the pizza stall. And also see how horrendous our pathway looks up this way, so we got to get some handymen organized to cover all this. That's the trouble with starting to set out the handyman confined space or areas there where they have to walk. Once you start it, you got to keep it going, and for me that kind of is a challenge sometimes because I don't like that side of the management of the game. It's especially in a scenario where you're on a time crunch. I mean, thankfully you can pause it and do all this, so that's not a huge issue. It's always sort of a tedious process for me that I just don't love. But we're going to get it covered, and hopefully it'll clean up the pathway a little bit. Thankfully, it really doesn't matter. Like, nasty pathways don't kill your park rating in any kind of huge way as long as you're somewhat on top of it. So it's alright. So the first part of this layout for the bobsled, we kind of redid it a little bit, and we're going to change it again because I didn't love this. It ended up being fairly long here. So typically, Mack bobsled has your lift hill. You got a flat section on top of the lift to get the whole train flat before you drop into the trough. And then you have a couple of helixes down. Sometimes it's a larger kind of shallow drop to begin with, and then it goes into a break. And then after that, kind of the bulk of the layout starts. So the first portion up to the first block is usually not terribly long. So we struggled here for a little bit trying to get this thing to line up properly. Looking at a couple different options. And fairly often on the bobsled coasters, they're decently formulaic. And part of that is that there's just not a lot of options for what you can do with it. In RCT, there's even less options from a piece standpoint because you don't have the diagonals, you don't have quarter or helix pieces, you don't have really anything to work with. But what we're going to end up doing is something fairly simple here in the end, is just have a drop off into this kind of larger climbing helix or diving helix, and then go into our block break there. So it's a much shorter start than it was originally, but it actually fits a little better with the ride itself. So now we can throw in a proper brake run, change up our entrance and our exit here, and we have a slightly more realistic bobsled, at least the start of it. Like I said before, the second half is fairly meandering, and we'll get to that a little later. I kind of think of this bobsled more similar to Park Asterix, Trail of Hooray, if you call it in English. And that's, to me, one of the more unique bobsleds out there, probably the most unique of the Mack bobsleds. And it kind of has a very long meandering layout. That one also has 2 blocks or 2 mid-course breaks within its layout, so we can stick with that. So now we are kind of in the final throes of our scenario here into August, and nearly to where we need to be from a people standpoint. We need 100 more guests to get to our 1,200, which is fine. We haven't really been hurrying on this. We also haven't really been doing any kind of advertising or anything, so we spent a lot of time building coasters and getting the layouts looking good. So we do have to catch up here a little bit. I think I do run some advertising campaigns. I think we already ran one, but it doesn't really bother me if we need to. I mean, that's just a game mechanic that we can use, so not too bad. So the park's looking pretty good now. Feels like it's fleshed out decently well, and I'm going to change the colors of that wooden coaster. You can either go for the whitewashed look or for the brown look, but I feel like the brown blends in a little bit better with the park. Although we did have a nice balance there between the white of the bobsled and the white of the coaster. Fit fairly well. But we do have all of our thrill rides unlocked, so it would make sense to put in a 3D cinema up here just to get that soft guest gap up, and also to add in something on this side just so we can kind of build out this selection of attractions on this side a little bit. This pathway kind of becomes a bit of a dead zone from the Invertigo all the way around to the bobsled. There's just nothing there for you to do, so we do want to add something to keep it somewhat interesting as we warp around. So our last coaster here is going to be one that we're going to kind of throw in here fairly quickly, and the easiest thing to do for that is a Vekoma Junior Boomerang. We've done so many of these in the series, but they are a fairly easy way to do a ride, and also fit the park fairly well. Works well with terrain as well too, which is good. We're going to move our pathway just a little bit, but I'm trying to do a little bit of interaction here where we kind of build this thing up into our in between our Flume and our suspended coaster. Not like we're hurting for room, it just felt like a cool place to do it. So we're going to try and nestle the station here into the hillside here. I stuck it through a tunnel initially, and then the thing just glitched through the side of it, so it just doesn't look good. So we're going to basically just excavate out that hill, and then we can put ourselves a lift hill that goes up the other side here. There we go. It's not a very long ride, doesn't need to be. These Junior Boomerangs don't go very long, but the thing is it works fairly fine, and we can just stick with it this way. So that works fairly well. We're going to change up to a green because someone in chat suggested a green like Far Up Summerland's coaster that also is a Junior Boomerang, and kind of a similar layout where it's almost an out and back kind of thing. Doesn't have any helixes, doesn't have any crossovers, just kind of goes out, has a little bit of a tunnel, and then comes on back. The lime green is always a little bit of a challenge, I feel like, from a color palette standpoint, and this park ends up being kind of all over the place with the color palette, because you've got the secondary color being used on the vertical drop with the rails, you've got it also used on the bobsled with the ribbing, but then some of the other ones have like the flat red, which is sort of more muted, the darker orange on the suspended, which is a little more muted, and then the green is sort of bright and in your face on the suspended or the Junior Boomerang. So there's a little bit of this back and forth on how well we want the whole thing to blend together, and I do like when you zoom out on the map to have this sort of harmony of colors and look and everything. We don't necessarily have that on this one, but I don't think it looks too bad, so we can stick with it. But here we are, October 31st, and a winner. So not by much, by about 120 guests, which isn't too bad. So I think we can deal with that. It works fairly well. We have a lot of space still that we could have expanded into, and actually a couple of flat sections up there on top of those plateaus, but didn't need it, and really I don't feel like we were building on top of each other too much for the whole thing. Everything feels like it's got its own space to work with, which is fine. As I said earlier, I do want to do one more block break on this bobsled, and let us get rid of that little straight section there towards the end, just to smooth this thing out. So this is a little bit of a post-victory build here, and struggle a little bit with this one too, and in general I just find bobsleds to be slightly challenging in this game to get a smooth look, because you've really got to use your turns to transition into other turns. Hills just don't work here. Obviously there's the game mechanic of the thing just flies off if you have your crests when it's going too fast, but also, it's just not realistic. You really connect your elements here with the turns, and one turn rolls into the next turn, just like a real bobsled course. So, trying to do that and trying to do it in a smooth way. This one works, but it also doesn't really look good. Part of the challenge that I tend to have is when you're going slower, I prefer the smaller helixes. When you're going larger, or when you're going faster, I prefer the larger helixes. So you don't want to have a large one that ends in a smaller one, and it's not necessarily like a coaster that's fixed to the track where you can tighten up the radii and get a more intense ride experience. This thing is freewheeling through this trough. So as it sort of stands to reason logically, as you go a little bit faster, you want a larger radius so that the thing still can track through the trough of the ride. So something like this, where we have a smaller helix that opens up into a larger helix, this is kind of the thing that I like to go with. Feels slightly better and feels like a more, it feels like something that just looks better. It looks less top heavy, for example. So we can do something like this, where we have the larger helix right here at the bottom. It's a little bit weird because we're kind of stacking it in the same plane here, but where it's just kind of stacked and then the one just kind of goes out further. And I realize that everything that I just said is kind of going away since I used the small turn here at the end, but I think that's probably okay because it's raising up to get into the final brakes. But that adjusts it fairly well, and I feel like we hit a middle ground of still looking like the original, but also getting some more realistic details in there. But let's jump over to the real-time portion here, and let's have a look at the whole park in its final state. And here we are with our completed Mel's World Park. We fit a fair bit of coasters in here as it ended up. We've got, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 different coasters, so not too bad, I think. So let's start our tour here at the entrance. Like I said before, I thought this slope was sort of a cool entrance to look across to the inverted coaster and kind of the park as a whole. It sort of opens up your view as you walk down the hill, which I think is sort of neat. Got our carousel here at the bottom, and a pretty cool coaster entry statement here with the vertical drop coaster just kind of sticking its way around that carousel, and then also using this hillside here for this kind of nice drop underneath the pathway and kind of coming around. I think the layout works fairly well for the limited pieces that we've got. Got our double inverter ship over on this side, and our 2 thrill rides over here. We have our shot tower and the top spin, which were both original attractions for the scenario. And over here we've got our Invertigo, which is currently broken down apparently, but we're still pulling a little bit of a line, which is good. Our 3D cinema up here on the hillside. I don't love these rides, as I've said many a time, but it does fill out the park fairly well and gives us what we need from a peep standpoint. I realized I did not do the stats, which I usually do. So the vertical drop is a high medium, which is not too bad. Fits about where we want it to be. The Invertigo is high, very high, which is not totally surprising. With those shuttle coasters, you got to be fairly fast into this first inversion, so then you can make it back on the second, since we don't have the luxury of the real life extra chain lift to get it up to the high point to return it. For our bobsled coaster here, we have highs down the board. This now runs our 3 trains and runs them fairly well. We had to do a little bit of adjustment to the blocking system just so that it worked correctly, but I think it turned out okay. I'm pretty happy with it. So now we are getting a fairly good queue as well, and that might just be a factor of the using the block brakes now, because the capacity does go down a little bit when you go from continuous circuit mode to continuous circuit block section mode, but that's just part of it. The inverted coaster here in the middle, Flightmare. So this was one of my favorite layouts as it turned out, and it is still broken down, so let's fix this. Maybe we just don't have enough staff, but anyway. So we went for more of a traditional vertical drop, or just not vertical drop, inverted coaster layout with a nice curving drop here after our pre-drop. 0G roll here, running a little slow perhaps, but not too bad. Nice helix off of that 0G. A little bit of a meandering section here in the middle, a mid corkscrew, and a kind of late ride Immelman here, which is sort of an early ride inversion typically. Wrap into our upward helix here, and a final flat spin into our brakes. We do miss that little drop underneath the pathway that came with the original one, but on the whole, I think this is a much better layout than was original for the park. And this is high, very high, high, which is about what you'd expect for an inverted coaster. These are usually fairly intense, so I will take it, and that cue shows me that it's working just fine. So here's our car ride, which actually did get some people here in the end, so somehow we managed to get that to work, and fairly happy with that, as is our little haunted house here in the corner with our little lagoon and everything like that. Over here in what we were calling the kids area, we've got a spiral slide, we've got this train that kind of wraps all around and goes underneath this little plateau here. Got our maze, a little hedge maze here that does a great job filling in all these sort of awkward shaped spaces. And then our little wooden coaster over here, which is going to do high, high, medium, which is sort of interesting because it's a family coaster, but you know, we didn't bank any of the corners, which is fairly traditional for this kind of a coaster. Again, all your corners should be high up off the ground, so you kind of go up into those turnarounds rather than down into them. So that's part of what you do to limit the amount of G's there, but you're still going to get some, clearly. And it's hitting that fairly fast, that final turn, which is what it is. I would rather have the aesthetics than I would have the rating, so I will take it. If we connect our pathway around the backside here, our final loop, we have our swinging ship here, and then our the Vekoma Junior Boomerang, which I forget who in chat suggested it be called Leg Day. I'm not sure why, but here it is. Medium, high, medium, and there we go. So that one is fairly small, but it works, gets us capacity, and does what we need. The log flume I'm pretty happy with because it's got a decent little layout, just kind of meanders around up there in the woods, and then drops down into this nice drop, which actually I feel like is framed fairly well with this pathway coming down the hillside here, so you can kind of see that log flume dropping head on towards you, which is sort of neat. And the water, I think, looks good as a thing to kind of make this whole area a little more cohesive, I guess, so we can kind of wrap everything around the lake. And then finally we have our suspended coaster here up at the top, which I'm fairly happy with the layout. It's like I said earlier, it's a fairly short layout, but in general not too bad. Here's our sort of signature drop, the sort of right-left combo there into the turnaround. And then we've got this kind of second half here with a fairly dynamic figure eight, and I do like this one here, and then over top of the log flume drop there at the end and up into the brakes. This one is doing highs down the board as well. So that's Mel's World. We won the scenario here as typical, and next up is Mothball Mountain, I believe. And if you want to see all of our streams for these, I do live stream every one of these on twitch.tv/Amusement Academy. We are, as of the recording of this, through the next two, Mothball Mountain and Pacific Pyramids, but there are more to come. Typically I stream on Friday nights. So if you want to check that out, then definitely feel free to do so. You can find a link down below in the description, as well as a link to our Discord, where you can catch up on all of this kind of stuff as well. Thank you for putting up with my fragile voice here as I've been getting over being sick. I've had several YouTube comments saying that I sound like either Seth Rogen or Kermit, so certainly would be interested in your comments of who do I sound like on the videos, because I think that's always kind of funny to me. So here we are, and let's go look at our before and afters, and we will see you in the next video. So until next time, thank you all very much for watching. We'll catch you later. Bye now.